Chicago, 1893. The city glitters like a jewel. The World's Fair has transformed it into a beacon of progress. Crowds pour in from across the globe, marveling at electric lights, mechanical wonders, and towering architecture that seems to scrape the heavens. It is a celebration of the future. But just a few blocks away, another building has risen in quiet shadows. At first glance, it appears respectable. A 3-story structure, part hotel, part pharmacy, built by a charming young doctor who greets guests with polished manners and a smile that inspires trust. His name is Henry Howard Holmes. The locals call him friendly, sophisticated, even generous. To his neighbors, he is the model of success in this booming city. Women swoon over his sharp suits and soft-spoken confidence. Businessmen admire his ambition. Few could imagine that beneath his courteous facade lay something unspeakable. Because Holmes's hotel was no ordinary inn. It was a labyrinth of deceit, windowless rooms that locked only from the outside, staircases that led to brick walls, trapdoors hidden in the floor, and chutes that plunged straight into the basement. A place designed not for rest, but for silence, for disappearance, for death. Guests checked in. Many never checked out. And yet, Holmes continued to walk the streets as a respected doctor and businessman. He was the devil in plain sight, an educated man in broad daylight, hiding a darkness so vast it would make him one of the most infamous killers in American history. But who was he really? To understand how Henry Howard Holmes became the monster behind the murder castle, we have to go back to the childhood of a boy named Herman Webster Mudgett. Because monsters are not always born. Sometimes they are made. Before the world knew him as H. Holmes, he was Herman Webster Mudgett. Born in 1861 in the quiet town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire, his life began far from the noise of Chicago's skyline. But even in the countryside, something about him seemed different. Neighbors would later recall a boy both brilliant and unsettling. Herman was highly intelligent, gifted in school, curious about science, and fascinated by anatomy. But his intelligence came with a darker edge. He was secretive, manipulative, and unafraid of things that made others recoil. There is one story that lingers in the folklore of his childhood. Bullied by classmates, Herman was once dragged into a Dr. E.S. office, where a human skeleton stood as a teaching tool. Terrified, the boys shoved him toward it, expecting him to scream. But young Herman didn't cry. He didn't run. Instead, he reached out and touched the cold bones with fascination, as though meeting an old friend. It was the first sign that death to him wasn't fear, it was fascination. As he grew, so did his appetite for control. Herman dissected animals with eerie precision, not out of cruelty, but curiosity, or at least, that's how he explained it. To those around him, he was simply bright. To Herman, every cut, every bone was a lesson. By his teenage years, he had already learned how to lie with charm. He could look a teacher in the eye, fabricate a story, and walk away unpunished. His talent for deception would become one of his deadliest weapons. When he entered medical school in Vermont, that talent flourished. He charmed professors, impressed fellow students, and seemed destined for a respectable career as a doctor. But behind the classroom doors, Herman discovered a lucrative scheme. With access to cadavers, he stole bodies, mutilated them, and passed them off as victims of accidents, collecting insurance payouts with forged documents. It was a chilling preview of crimes yet to come. By the time he graduated, Herman Webster Mudgett had shed his old identity like a snake shedding skin. He became Henry Howard Holmes, Dr. Holmes, a man of learning, respectability, and trust. But behind the polished name was still that same boy who had touched a skeleton without fear. Holmes wasn't just interested in medicine anymore. He was interested in control, in money, and in the thrill of living behind a mask. And Chicago, the fastest growing city in America, was waiting for him. When Holmes arrived in Chicago in the late 1880s, the city was a beast in motion. Skyscrapers clawed at the sky, immigrants poured in daily, and opportunity was everywhere for a man clever enough or ruthless enough to seize it. Holmes quickly embedded himself in the community. He found work at a drugstore in the Englewood neighborhood, charming the elderly owner and soon after acquiring the store for himself, under circumstances that still raise questions. But the drugstore was only a stepping stone. Holmes had bigger plans, plans that required bricks, mortar, and deception. Across the street he purchased a vacant lot. There, he began construction on a massive 3-story building. To the public, it was advertised as a grand hotel to welcome visitors to the upcoming World S Fair of 1893. But for Holmes, it was something else entirely. The design was strange from the very beginning. Workers complained of bizarre instructions, hallways that led nowhere, staircases ending abruptly at solid walls, rooms with no windows, and doors that could only lock from the outside. When carpenters asked questions, Holmes dismissed them or quietly fired them, replacing crews before anyone could understand the full blueprint. No single worker ever saw the entire plan. The building was a patchwork of secrets. Hidden rooms sat between walls. Some chambers were lined with iron plates, airtight, and fitted with gas lines Holmes could control from his office. There were trap doors in the floors that opened to chutes, dropping straight into the basement. Down there, Holmes installed a large furnace, big enough to dispose of almost anything, or anyone. To outsiders, Holmes explained these quirks away as innovations for security and efficiency, a businessman protecting his investment. But the truth was far darker. The structure itself was a weapon, a machine built to ensnare, suffocate, and erase human beings. When it was complete, Chicago residents called it the Castle. Its sharp angles and looming size gave it a presence both impressive and unnerving. Locals passed it daily, unaware that its walls held more than plaster and brick. They held intentions soaked in malice. Holmes walked those halls like a king surveying his kingdom, every locked door and hidden passage reinforcing his power. Soon women would check in, lured by promises of work or romance, and soon after, the castle would swallow them whole. But Holmes was not only a builder of walls. He was a builder of lies, weaving relationships and scams with the same precision he used to lay bricks. The castle was ready, and now, the hunt could begin. The World's Fair opened in May 1893, and Chicago exploded with visitors. The castle sat waiting just a short distance away, its doors promising comfort and opportunity to the curious, the ambitious, and the vulnerable. Holmes knew exactly who to target. He was handsome, articulate, and carried himself with the polished confidence of a successful doctor. To young women, many of whom had come to Chicago alone in search of work, he seemed like a dream. One of them was Julia Smythe. She worked in Holmes's drugstore and became romantically involved with him. Julia believed Holmes loved her, but when she demanded commitment, she and her daughter Pearl vanished without explanation. Holmes later hinted at their fate, but the truth of their final moments died with him. Then came Emmeline Cigrand, a bright young woman hired as his secretary. Holmes courted her with promises of marriage, dazzling her with charm. Neighbors saw her enter the castle one evening in December 1892. No one saw her leave. And there was Minnie Williams, a woman who inherited valuable property in Texas. Holmes seduced her, convinced her to sign over her inheritance, and then she too disappeared within the castle's maze of rooms. Some reports suggest her sister Anna came to visit, only for both women to vanish. Each story followed the same pattern: trust built carefully, charm used like a weapon, and then silence. Holmes's victims walked willingly into his trap, never realizing that the hallways were designed to confuse, that the rooms were designed to kill. Witnesses would later describe the methods. Some rooms were airtight chambers where Holmes could release gas at will, watching his victims suffocated. Others were soundproof, designed so no scream could escape. And when it was over, their bodies were dropped down a chute to the basement furnace, or stripped for bones and sold to medical schools. Chicago's streets bustled with life, music, and laughter, while inside the castle, lives were quietly erased. To neighbors, Holmes was still the charming doctor, the successful businessman. To his victims, he was the last face they ever saw. By the time the fair ended, Holmes's body count had grown. But murder was only half his story, because while he preyed on flesh and blood upstairs, downstairs he was weaving a web of fraud and schemes that made him as untouchable as any predator. And soon, those schemes would catch the wrong kind of attention. Holmes was not just a killer. He was a consummate con man. To the outside world, his hotel was a business venture. But behind the front doors, and on paper, it was a financial web of lies. Holmes mastered the art of fraud. He opened sham businesses, bought goods on credit under false names, and never paid suppliers. He charmed investors into handing over cash for projects that never existed. Each time creditors closed in, Holmes reinvented himself, slipping away like smoke through a keyhole. Insurance fraud became one of his favorite games. He would take out policies on business partners or associates, then stage accidents, or worse. Death meant payouts, and payouts meant freedom to build his empire. Even in medical school, Holmes had practiced this, mutilating cadavers to look like accident victims and collecting the money. In Chicago, the scheme evolved into something far deadlier. Holmes also lived a double life in his personal relationships. He married multiple women, often without divorcing the last, juggling identities with ease. To one woman, he was a devoted husband. To another, a bachelor doctor. To the next, a wealthy entrepreneur. Each lie carefully constructed, each role played with chilling conviction. And while his partners believed in his charm, Holmes was calculating their worth, sometimes in dollars, sometimes in property, and sometimes in flesh. This dual existence allowed him to thrive. To creditors, he was elusive but brilliant. To women, he was romantic and trustworthy. To strangers, he was simply a successful doctor. And all the while, upstairs in the castle, his darker appetites continued without interruption. But the more elaborate his cons became, the more dangerous the game grew. Every forged signature, every vanished business partner, every unpaid debt left a trail. And trails, no matter how faint, have a way of being followed. Holmes believed he was untouchable. But shadows were gathering. Shadows in the form of suspicious creditors, insurance companies, and eventually, a determined detective who would stop at nothing to expose him. For years, Holmes had slipped through cracks with ease. Debts erased, partners vanished, lies carefully spun. But every scheme leaves threads, and in 1894, those threads began to tangle. It started not with murder, but with money. Holmes's insurance scams grew bolder, and one in particular drew suspicion. He and an accomplice, Benjamin Petezel, staged a plan. Petezel would fake his own death, and his family would collect the insurance payout. But when authorities examined the case, details didn't add up. The body found wasn't an accident victim. It was Petezel himself, burned and mutilated beyond recognition. Holmes hadn't faked his partner's death. He had murdered him. The insurance company balked, investigators began digging, and soon a relentless detective named Frank Geyer entered the scene. Unlike others before him, Geyer wasn't dazzled by Holmes's charm. He followed paper trails, asked questions Holmes thought no one would dare, and pulled on the smallest threads until they unraveled entire schemes. As Geyer investigated, he discovered another horror. Petezel's 3 children, left in Holmes's care during the scheme, had disappeared. Witnesses recalled seeing them with Holmes, boarding trains, moving from city to city. But somewhere along the way, their trail went cold. The question hung heavy. What had Holmes done with them? Meanwhile, whispers spread in Chicago about the strange building in Englewood. Former workers recalled its bizarre construction. Creditors demanded answers. Police began circling the castle itself. For the first time, Holmes felt pressure closing in. The perfect mask he had worn for years began to crack. The charming doctor could no longer explain away every lie, every vanished woman, every missing child. And when authorities finally took Holmes into custody, at first for fraud, they had no idea they were about to uncover something far darker than financial crimes. The doors of the castle were about to be forced open, and what lay inside would shock the world. When police finally forced their way into Holmes's castle, they expected fraud, maybe stolen goods, perhaps some proof of insurance scams. What they found was something far more sinister. The castle was a maze of nightmares. Behind seemingly ordinary doors were hidden chambers. Staircases led to nowhere. Trapdoors opened into dark chutes that dropped straight to the basement. Entire rooms were soundproofed. Gas pipes fed into sealed chambers, controlled by hidden valves in Holmes's office. In the basement, officers made a series of discoveries that turned suspicion into certainty. First, a surgical table, its surface scarred with cuts and burns. Nearby, jars of mysterious chemicals, vats filled with acid, and a furnace capable of reducing a human body to ash. Then came bones, fragments of ribs, vertebrae, and children's teeth. Investigators realized they were standing inside a slaughterhouse, disguised as a hotel. As word spread, the press descended on Chicago, dubbing Holmes the Beast of Chicago and America's first serial killer. Papers ran lurid headlines about the murder castle, fueling both terror and fascination. Crowds gathered outside Englewood, craning their necks to glimpse the building where unspeakable acts had taken place. Meanwhile, Frank Geyer's relentless pursuit led him beyond the castle. In Toronto, he uncovered shallow graves containing the remains of 2 of the Petezel children. In Indianapolis, the body of the 3rd was discovered, hidden in a house Holmes had rented. Each finding confirmed what many feared. Holmes had not only betrayed his partner, but extinguished innocent lives to protect himself. The castle itself became an exhibit of horror. Detectives mapped out hidden corridors and secret chambers, each revealing Holmes's chilling ingenuity. It wasn't madness, it was method. Every feature had been carefully designed, every lock and hidden passage serving a purpose. This was not improvisation. It was premeditation on an industrial scale. Holmes, when confronted, smiled. He denied nothing outright, but admitted nothing either. He reveled in the attention, even as evidence piled up. He seemed to enjoy watching the world try to comprehend the depths of his evil. For the public, the shock was immense. Chicago was no longer just the city of the World's Fair, a beacon of progress. It was now home to a house of horrors, where modern ambition had merged with medieval cruelty. The devil had been captured, but the true reckoning had only just begun. Holmes would now face trial, and in the courtroom, his mask would slip for the final time. The trial of H.H. Holmes began in October 1895. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers and witnesses, but with journalists and curious citizens eager to lay eyes on the man who had been branded the devil in the White City. Holmes represented himself at times, charming the jury with eloquence, wit, and even humor. He spoke with the poise of a gentleman, the calm of a doctor. But against him stood the undeniable evidence, the remains of the Petezel children, testimony about insurance fraud, and the horrifying discoveries within his castle. The trial focused primarily on the murder of Benjamin Petezel. On October 28th, Holmes was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. But Holmes wasn't finished with the world yet. Awaiting execution, he wrote a confession for the newspapers. In it, he claimed to have killed 27 people, though investigators suspected the number was much higher. Some historians believe the true toll may have been closer to 200. Holmes, however, seemed to enjoy the ambiguity. He gave the world numbers without faces, horror without resolution. In his writings, he described himself as born with the devil inside him. He said he could not help his compulsion, as if evil had been written into his very bones. And perhaps the most unsettling truth, he never once expressed genuine remorse. On May 7, 1896, in Philadelphia, H.H. Holmes was led to the gallows. He showed no fear. Witnesses said he maintained his composure to the very end, speaking calmly before the trapdoor opened beneath him. Even in death, he tried to control the narrative, to remain the enigma he had always been. His castle in Chicago was stripped, looted, and later destroyed by fire in 1895, before being torn down completely. Today, a U.S. Postal Service building stands on the site. To the thousands who pass it daily, it appears ordinary. But beneath the ground, where the castle's basement once stretched, the ghosts of his victims remain etched into history. Holmes's story endures not because of his body count, but because of what he represented. He was the perfect predator for his age, an age of booming cities, unchecked ambition, and blind faith in appearances. In the shadows of America's shining new modernity, he built a house of horrors, proving that progress can hide rot, and that evil does not always appear as a monster in the woods. Sometimes it wears a bowler hat, smiles politely, and offers you a room for the night. Holmes's legacy is one of fascination and fear, a reminder that the true terror often lies not in the supernatural, but in the ordinary man who learns to wear a mask better than anyone else. Evil rarely announces itself. It doesn't always snarl, bare its teeth, or stalk in the shadows. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it wears a fine suit, shakes your hand, and tells you what you want to hear. H.Holmes was not just a killer, he was a mirror of his age. In the heart of a city celebrating progress, he built a monument to human suffering. His murder castle has long since vanished, but its memory lingers, a chilling reminder of how cruelty can hide in plain sight, shielded by charm, ambition, and opportunity. And while Holmes himself is gone, his story continues to fascinate because deep down, we recognize a terrifying truth. Monsters are not always strangers in the dark. Sometimes they live among us, waiting for the right moment to strike. If this story gripped you as much as it did us, make sure you resubscribed and turn on notifications so you never miss the next descent into the darker chapters of history. Because as long as there are stories like this, we'll be here to tell them.